Picture this. It's 985 after Christ, and you're a Viking merchant sailing the North Atlantic in what's basically a glorified wooden bathtub. The storm that's about to hit you isn't just any storm. It's the kind of tempest that makes grown Norse warriors pray to gods they usually only remember when they're dying. Eirik Thornson, 32 years old, and built like the Norwegian pine trees his family had been shaping into longhouses for generations, is about to discover something that will change Viking civilization forever. But first, he has to survive the next few hours. The wind hits Eirik's merchant vessel like a giant's fist. We're talking about waves the size of small mountains, the kind that would make modern sailors in steel ships think twice about leaving port. But this is the Viking Age, and these people didn't have the luxury of weather forecasts or Coast Guard rescues. When you committed to crossing the North Atlantic, you were essentially rolling dice with your life, and Eirik's dice were coming up snake eyes. His longship, 30 feet of oak and iron that had carried him safely through a dozen trading voyages, splits apart on Iceland's volcanic coast like kindling. The sound alone would have been terrifying, that deep, groaning crack of wood surrendering to forces beyond human comprehension, followed by the roar of freezing seawater rushing in to claim another victim. Most of his crew doesn't make it. In the chaos of shipwreck, with ice-cold water shocking the breath from his lungs and debris spinning around him like weapons, Eirik somehow manages to grab hold of something, maybe a piece of the mast, maybe just divine luck, and gets hurled toward shore. Now, you have to understand something about Iceland in 985. This isn't the tourist destination we know today. This is the edge of the known world. A landscape so alien that Vikings, people who thought nothing of sailing into the unknown, called it the land of fire and ice. When Eirik drags himself up that beach, half drowned and completely alone, he's looking at a coastline that seems designed by the gods to kill anyone foolish enough to set foot on it. But here's where the story gets interesting. Bleeding, exhausted, and with hypothermia already setting in, Eirik spots something that doesn't make sense. Steam rising from a crack in the volcanic rock. Not the kind of steam you'd see from boiling water, but gentle, warm vapor drifting up from deep underground. Following that steam like a lifeline, he crawls into what appears to be just another cave. What he finds inside changes everything. The cave isn't just warm, it's perfectly, impossibly warm. While a blizzard begins raging outside that will last for 3 days, Eirik discovers himself in what can only be described as nature's own central heating system. Volcanic steam vents, hidden deep in the rock, have created a microclimate that feels like spring in the middle of an Icelandic winter. The temperature stays constant, the air remains breathable. It's as if someone designed the perfect survival shelter and then disguised it as an ordinary cave. This is where Eirik's background becomes crucial. He wasn't just any shipwrecked Viking. He was the son of a Norwegian master builder, raised in a tradition that went back generations. His grandmother, Astrid the Wise, had filled his childhood with stories about the eternal battle between heat and cold, teaching him that earth spirits controlled these forces in ways humans barely understood. Most Vikings heard these stories and filed them away as folklore. Eirik had always listened differently. Growing up in traditional Norwegian longhouses, Eirik had experienced firsthand what winter meant for his people. Picture your family huddled around a smoking fire pit in the center of a wooden hall, with temperatures so cold that people regularly lost fingers and toes to frostbite. Imagine watching infants die not from disease or violence, but simply because the cold was stronger than human endurance. These weren't occasional tragedies, they were annual inevitabilities that Vikings accepted as the price of northern living. But young Eirik had always asked the questions that made adults uncomfortable. Why could Vikings conquer nations but couldn't conquer climate? Why did warriors who feared nothing in battle spend half their lives shivering? Why did they control vast trade networks, spanning continents but couldn't figure out how to stay warm in their own homes? Now, lying in this impossible cave while the storm rages outside, those childhood questions suddenly had context. The earth itself was showing him answers that no human teacher had ever provided. This wasn't magic or divine intervention. This was engineering on a scale that made human construction look primitive. The volcanic vents weren't randomly placed. They followed patterns, creating air circulation that maintained perfect temperature and humidity. The cave walls absorbed heat during the day and radiated it back at night, creating natural thermal regulation that worked better than anything Vikings had ever built. For 3 months, while his broken ribs healed and search parties gave him up for dead, Eirik became a student of Iceland's thermal secrets. The local builders who eventually found him weren't just Norse settlers trying to survive. They were innovators who had spent decades learning to work with volcanic heat instead of against it. Under the guidance of master builder Thorgrim Steepslope, a man whose nickname came from his ability to channel steam up seemingly impossible inclines, Eirik discovered construction techniques that revolutionized his understanding of what buildings could accomplish. These Icelanders showed him structures that used stone passages to direct volcanic heat with surgical precision. They demonstrated how ancient Roman knowledge of hypercausts, those underground heating systems that had warmed bathhouses across the empire, had survived in Iceland's isolation, preserved by builders who understood that comfort wasn't luxury, but survival. Most shocking of all, they revealed the economic mathematics that would transform Eirik's worldview. While Norwegian settlements spent 70% of their labor cutting firewood just to survive winter, Icelandic communities channeled unlimited heat directly from the earth. When Eirik finally returned to Trondheim in 986, carrying plans and techniques that seemed impossible to his homeland's builders, he faced the skepticism that greets any revolutionary idea. His own brother mocked what he called foreign foolishness, dismissing thermal construction as impractical sorcery that might work in volcanic Iceland, but would never succeed in normal Norway. That skepticism lasted exactly 1 week. Eirik built a small test structure using his new methods, incorporating lessons learned from months, studying Iceland's thermal masters. When a bitter frost settled over Trondheim, the kind of cold snap that usually meant days of constant fire tending and sleepless nights feeding wood into smoking pits, Eirik's building stayed warm using half the normal fuel. Half. In a society where fuel consumption determined survival, this wasn't just an improvement, it was revolution. Word spread through Trondheim's close-knit building community like wildfire. Here was a master craftsman, son of respected builders, who had returned from the edge of the world with knowledge that could transform how Vikings lived. But Eirik knew that convincing his neighbors was only the beginning. If thermal construction was going to change Viking civilization, it would need royal approval, and that meant facing the greatest challenge of his life. Because in 987, King Harald Fairhair had begun hearing rumors about a builder in Trondheim who claimed to work sorcery with stone and steam. And Harald Fairhair was not a king who ignored rumors about sorcery in his realm. When King Harald Fairhair's royal summons arrived in Trondheim during the spring of 987, Eirik Thornson knew his life had just taken a turn that could end very badly. The king's messenger delivered the command with the kind of formal politeness that barely concealed a threat. Eirik would travel to Bergen immediately to demonstrate his building methods for the crown or face charges of deceiving the realm with false sorcery. In medieval Norway, that second option usually involved a very public and very painful death. You have to understand Harald Fairhair's position here. This was a king who had spent decades unifying Norway through a combination of brilliant strategy and ruthless violence. He'd earned his nickname by vowing not to cut his hair until he ruled all of Norway, and when he finally got that haircut, the celebration lasted for weeks. Harald didn't stay in power by ignoring rumors about potential threats to his authority, and a craftsman claiming to have discovered revolutionary building secrets definitely qualified as a potential threat. The royal compound at Bergen in 987 was the beating heart of Norwegian power, a collection of buildings that represented the finest traditional craftsmanship in the realm. When Eirik arrived, he found himself facing not just royal skepticism, but professional hostility from the kingdom's most established builders. Leading this opposition was Bjorn Ironside, whose family had held royal building contracts for 5 generations, and who viewed Eirik's thermal methods as a direct challenge to everything his bloodline represented. Bjorn was exactly the kind of master craftsman you'd expect to find in a royal court, supremely skilled, politically connected, and absolutely convinced that traditional Norse building methods represented the pinnacle of human achievement. He'd overseen construction of the King's Great Hall, the Royal Armoury, and a dozen other structures that showcased 5 centuries of accumulated Norwegian building wisdom. The idea that some shipwrecked merchant had discovered superior techniques during a few months in Iceland wasn't just professionally insulting, it was personally devastating. The challenge Harald Fairhair proposed seemed deceptively simple. Each master builder would construct identical longhouses somewhere in the royal compound, and the king would judge which served better after a full winter of testing. But simple challenges between skilled craftsmen often become the most brutal competitions, because professional pride runs deeper than mere money or even personal safety. Bjorn commanded a workforce of 50 traditional craftsmen, men whose families had been cutting timber and shaping joints for generations. They knew every technique passed down through the building guilds, every trick for selecting wood and calculating load-bearing capacity. When they looked at the materials allocated for the contest, they saw familiar challenges they'd solved hundreds of times before. Eirik's team consisted of exactly 12 people who believed in thermal construction principles, including his wife Gudrun, whose expertise proved absolutely crucial to the entire project. Gudrun had spent years managing her father's smithy fires, developing an intuitive understanding of heat flow and air circulation that most builders never acquired. While Bjorn's crew focused on traditional joinery and structural integrity, Gudrun calculated thermal dynamics with the precision of someone whose livelihood had always depended on controlling fire. The construction battle that followed revealed the true scope of Eirik's innovations. His thermal longhouse featured double walls filled with volcanic ash imported specifically from Iceland, an expense that made Bjorn's supporters laugh until they realized the implications. Those ash-filled walls didn't just provide insulation. They created thermal mass that absorbed heat during warm periods and released it gradually when temperatures dropped. The effect was revolutionary. Natural temperature regulation that required no human intervention. But the double walls were only the beginning. Eirik's design included underground channels that drew cool air during summer months and warm air during winter, using principles of natural convection that turned the building itself into a breathing organism. The roof vents weren't randomly placed according to traditional patterns. They followed seasonal wind directions that Eirik had mapped during his months in Iceland, creating air circulation that actually improved as weather conditions became more extreme. Watching these two construction projects proceed side by side must have been fascinating for anyone who understood building techniques. Bjorn's crew worked with practiced efficiency, creating a structure that represented the absolute peak of traditional Norwegian craftsmanship. Every joint was perfect, every timber selected for maximum strength and durability. It was the kind of longhouse that could shelter a family for generations and stand as a monument to Norse building mastery. Eirik's construction looked bizarre by comparison. The imported volcanic ash seemed like expensive foolishness. The underground channels appeared unnecessarily complicated, and the precisely calculated vent positions followed no pattern that traditional builders recognized. Bjorn's supporters spent months predicting that Eirik's strange building would collapse under the first serious snow load or prove impossible to heat during a real Norwegian winter. The sabotage came in November, when early snows began testing both structures. Bjorn's men either acting on their master's orders or simply unable to resist, undermining the competition secretly blocked Eirik's air channels during a night when the thermal building's test family was sleeping inside. This wasn't just professional rivalry anymore. It was attempted murder, because blocking those channels could have suffocated the family through carbon dioxide buildup. Young Olaf Quickhand, Eirik's most dedicated apprentice, discovered the sabotage purely by chance during an early morning inspection. Working frantically in the pre-dawn darkness, he cleared the blocked passages just minutes before King Harald arrived for his regular progress evaluation. If the king had found a family dead from suffocation in Eirik's experimental building, the thermal construction revolution would have ended before it began, and Eirik would probably have ended with it. When Harald Fairhair arrived for the final judgment during the brutal February freeze of 988, the difference between the two buildings was immediately obvious to anyone with functioning senses. The king's breath showed clearly in Bjorn's traditional hall, creating those visible vapor clouds that indicate truly cold indoor air. But stepping into Eirik's thermal building felt like entering a different season entirely warm, dry air that made winter clothing unnecessary and allowed comfortable conversation without the constant distraction of shivering. The real test came when the king's elderly mother, who suffered from the kind of joint pain that made Norwegian winters a personal torture, agreed to spend one night in each building. This wasn't just a comfort comparison. It was a medical evaluation by someone whose body served as an expert instrument for measuring thermal effectiveness. When she emerged from Eirik's building after her test night, moving like a woman 20 years younger and speaking enthusiastically about the first pain-free sleep she'd experienced in months, the demonstration was complete. Royal endorsement triggered an avalanche of demand that overwhelmed Eirik's small team almost immediately. Jarls throughout Norway began competing to build the most advanced thermal halls, treating thermal construction like a status symbol that demonstrated both wealth and forward-thinking leadership. The practical benefits were undeniable, but the social prestige of owning a Harald-approved thermal building proved equally powerful in driving adoption. Recognizing that demand would quickly outstrip his ability to personally oversee every project, Eirik established the Guild of Earth Builders with apprenticeship rules, designed to maintain quality while enabling rapid expansion. The requirements were demanding: 3 years studying traditional construction methods, 1 full year in Iceland learning thermal principles from the masters who had taught Eirik, then 2 additional years practicing under an established thermal craftsman before achieving independent master status. These training requirements weren't arbitrary bureaucracy. They reflected Eirik's understanding that thermal construction required fundamentally different thinking from traditional building. Apprentices needed to understand how heat moved through different materials, how air circulation patterns changed with seasonal weather shifts, and how to calculate thermal mass for different climates and usage patterns. The Iceland year was particularly crucial because only hands-on experience with volcanic heating could teach the intuitive understanding necessary for adapting thermal principles to non-volcanic environments. The innovation spread through Viking kinship networks with remarkable speed, carried by marriages that linked thermal knowledge to genetic inheritance. When Eirik's daughter Freydis married into the Dublin Vikings, she brought complete thermal building plans as part of her dowry, leading to Irish constructions that merged Viking thermal wisdom with Celtic underground building traditions. These cultural combinations often produced innovations that exceeded their original components, as different building traditions cross-pollinated to create entirely new approaches. By 990, just 3 years after the royal demonstration, thermal longhouses stretched from Greenland to Kiev. Each regional adaptation reflected local conditions and available materials, but all shared the fundamental principles Eirik had learned in that Icelandic cave. The Viking trade networks that had always carried goods and weapons now carried architectural knowledge that transformed how Northern Europeans survived their climate. But the real test of thermal construction was still coming, because in 991, nature was about to challenge every building technique in Scandinavia, with a winter that would make normal Norwegian cold seem tropical by comparison. The transformation that thermal building brought to Viking civilization by 990 wasn't just about staying warm, it was about completely reimagining what northern life could become. When Erik the Red's Greenland settlement faced its first devastating winter, survival came down to a single factor. His son Leif had trained with Eirik's Guild of Earth Builders and understood how to create thermal halls that could maintain livable temperatures when ice sheets surrounded them completely. Think about what Greenland represented in 990. This wasn't just the edge of the known world, it was a place so hostile to human life that even Vikings, people who thrived in conditions that would kill most civilizations, considered it a death sentence. Average winter temperatures that could freeze exposed skin in minutes, storms that lasted for weeks without pause, and ice formations thick enough to crush traditional buildings like eggshells. Yet Leif Erikson's thermal hall not only survived that first winter, but provided such comfortable conditions that families actually gained weight during the coldest months. The economic transformation was absolutely staggering when you examine the numbers. Traditional Viking settlements had required 100-man wood-cutting crews working continuously just to gather enough fuel for basic winter survival. These weren't small operations. We're talking about teams that spent 6 months of every year doing nothing but cutting, hauling, and splitting firewood, with entire communities organized around the simple necessity of not freezing to death. Thermal buildings changed this equation completely. Settlements that had required 100-man fuel crews now needed only 30 people for the same heating capacity. That meant 70% of a community's labor force was suddenly available for other activities: crafts, trading expeditions, territorial expansion, and cultural development. In economic terms, thermal construction didn't just improve Viking life, it created entirely new possibilities for Viking civilization. Women particularly benefited from this transformation, though not in ways that modern readers might expect. Consistent indoor temperatures allowed year-round textile work, transforming Viking cloth production from seasonal necessity to sophisticated industry. Traditional Norse weaving had been limited by climate. Wool processing required stable temperatures and humidity that winter conditions made impossible to maintain. Women spent months every year essentially unable to practice their most valuable skills because the environment wouldn't cooperate. Thermal buildings eliminated these seasonal restrictions completely. Viking women could now produce textiles with consistency and quality that competed directly with Byzantine silk in international markets. The economic impact was revolutionary. Communities that had always imported luxury fabrics began exporting them, generating wealth that funded further expansion and technological development. Some of the finest medieval tapestries originated in thermal workshops where Norse women perfected techniques impossible in traditional cold environments. The cultural implications reached far beyond economics into the spiritual realm of Viking society. Temple buildings using Eirik's thermal methods allowed year-round religious ceremonies that had previously been impossible during winter months. The Uppsala Temple in Sweden incorporated thermal design that kept sacred fires burning with minimal fuel consumption, which priests interpreted as divine approval of the new construction methods. This religious validation was crucially important for widespread acceptance. Vikings weren't just practical people, they were deeply spiritual, and any major innovation needed theological justification to gain complete social acceptance. When the priests declared that thermal buildings allowed more effective communication with the gods, remaining resistance to new construction methods largely evaporated. Religion and engineering had found common ground in architectural innovation. Artists discovered that stable indoor temperatures prevented wood cracking and paint deterioration, triggering an explosion of intricate carvings and decorations that transformed Viking material culture. Traditional Norse art had always been constrained by environmental factors. Detailed carvings couldn't survive temperature fluctuations that caused wood to expand and contract unpredictably, and paints failed in conditions where humidity changed dramatically with seasons. Thermal buildings provided the stable environment necessary for sophisticated artistic development. Woodcarvers could now attempt detailed work that would last for generations instead of seasons. Painters could use techniques requiring consistent drying conditions. Metalworkers could maintain forge temperatures with unprecedented precision. The result was a Nordic Renaissance that produced artwork rivaling anything created in Mediterranean climates. The famous Oseberg ship burial, discovered in modern times but dating to this period, included thermal building plans among the grave goods, a clear indication of how valuable this architectural knowledge had become. Vikings buried their most treasured possessions with important leaders, and the inclusion of construction documents alongside weapons, jewelry, and religious artifacts shows that thermal building techniques were considered among the most precious innovations of their civilization. But the ultimate test of thermal construction came during the catastrophic winter of 991, when temperatures plunged so dramatically that the Baltic Sea froze solid enough for armies to march across ice from Sweden to Denmark. This wasn't just unusually cold weather, it was a climate disaster that challenged every survival strategy Northern Europeans had developed. Traditional longhouses across Scandinavia collapsed under snow loads that exceeded anything in collective memory, or saw their inhabitants freeze despite desperate attempts to maintain heating fires. The fuel demands became impossible to meet when transportation systems broke down and supply networks failed. Entire communities disappeared during that winter, not through warfare or disease, but simply because the cold proved stronger than traditional Viking engineering. In Trondheim alone, over 300 lives were saved in Eirik's thermal constructions, while neighbouring traditional districts lost half their population to cold-related deaths. The contrast was so dramatic that it ended remaining resistance to thermal methods among even the most conservative builders. When survival depends on architecture, philosophical objections to innovation become irrelevant very quickly. The winter of 991 demonstrated something crucial about technological adoption. Sometimes nature provides test conditions so extreme that they settle debates definitively. Every theoretical argument about traditional versus thermal construction became meaningless when people could see the results literally written in survival statistics. Communities with thermal buildings thrived during conditions that killed communities without them. This vindication accelerated the spread of thermal construction throughout Northern Europe and beyond. Viking trading networks carried the techniques to Russia, where they merged with Slavic building traditions to create hybrid designs adapted for continental climates. Irish monks, always interested in practical innovations that improved monastery life, requested Viking thermal consultants to design heated scriptoriums where illuminated manuscripts could be created year-round. The English, despite their general hostility to Viking culture, quietly began incorporating thermal principles into castle and church construction, after observing the superior performance of Norse thermal buildings during severe weather. Professional pride meant they couldn't openly admit to learning from Vikings, but architectural evidence shows clear adoption of thermal techniques in English buildings constructed after 995. By the end of the 10th century, thermal construction had become so widespread that traditional building methods were considered antiquated and inefficient throughout most of Northern Europe. The transformation from experimental innovation to standard practice had taken less than 15 years' remarkably fast adoption for medieval technology. But Eirik Thornson wouldn't live to see the full scope of his revolution's impact, because in 995, at age 62, the master builder who had learned thermal wisdom in an Icelandic cave was about to make one final voyage that would test his innovations under completely new conditions. The North American climate was about to receive its first lesson in Viking thermal engineering. Eirik Thornson's final voyage to Vinland in 995 was supposed to be the culmination of his life's work, a chance to test thermal building methods in North America's completely different climate conditions. At 62, he was still the acknowledged master of thermal construction, still curious about how his techniques might adapt to new environments, still driven by the same questions that had shaped his entire career. But the North Atlantic had other plans. The storms that drove his ship off course weren't the dramatic ship-splitting tempests of his youth. These were the grinding, persistent weather systems that wear down experienced sailors through exhaustion rather than catastrophic violence. When Eirik finally reached land, it wasn't the planned Vinland settlement but a remote section of Newfoundland where rocky coasts offered little shelter and no established Norse communities. His death came peacefully in a cave that was remarkably similar to the Icelandic cavern where his thermal journey had begun 10 years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on his companions. The man who had revolutionized northern architecture died in exactly the kind of natural thermal shelter that had originally inspired his innovations. But even in death, Eirik was still working, still learning, still pushing the boundaries of what thermal construction could achieve. When Leif Erikson found the remains 3 years later during his own exploration of North American coasts, he discovered something extraordinary: preserved architectural plans that showed adaptations for climates Eirik had never actually experienced. Working from theoretical principles and careful observation during his final months, the master builder had designed thermal systems for southern regions, requiring cooling rather than heating, triple-wall configurations for Arctic conditions even more extreme than Greenland, and moisture control systems for coastal areas where humidity presented different challenges than dry Nordic cold. These documents became the Guild of Earth Builders' most sacred texts, copied and recopied through generations with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious scriptures. Medieval scribes treated Eirik's final plans as divine revelation, encoding thermal principles in illuminated manuscripts that preserved the knowledge through Europe's most chaotic periods. The Guild developed elaborate rituals around copying these texts, ensuring that crucial details weren't lost to scribal errors or cultural changes. The transformation of European architecture through Viking thermal wisdom happened subtly, often without acknowledgement of its Norse origins. As Viking builders worked on Christian churches throughout medieval Europe, they incorporated thermal principles that influenced Gothic cathedral design in ways that modern architects are only beginning to understand. The famous breathing walls of Chartres Cathedral, which maintain remarkably stable interior temperatures despite massive stone construction, trace directly to Norwegian builders who had learned from Eirik's students. Medieval monasteries became particularly enthusiastic adopters of Viking thermal techniques, improving them with preserved Roman hypercaust knowledge to create the first true central heating systems since the fall of the Western Empire. Monasteries needed consistent indoor temperatures for manuscript production, food preservation, and year-round religious activities, making them ideal testing grounds for thermal innovations. Many of Europe's greatest medieval libraries existed because thermal control allowed year-round scholarly work in climates that would otherwise have made intellectual activity seasonal. The builder guilds that emerged from Eirik's original organization protected thermal knowledge through Europe's medieval period using methods that seem almost mystical to modern observers. Craft symbols encoded thermal principles in visual languages that initiated craftsmen could read but outsiders couldn't decipher. Apprentice songs contained mathematical formulas for calculating thermal mass and air circulation, disguised as traditional folk melodies that could be transmitted orally across generations. When the Black Death devastated Europe in the 14th century, communities with thermal buildings showed measurably lower mortality rates than areas relying on traditional construction. The improved living conditions created by consistent heating and better air circulation reduced disease transmission and improved general health outcomes. Thermal buildings literally saved lives during Europe's greatest medical crisis, though the connection wasn't understood at the time. Renaissance architects rediscovered many thermal principles that Vikings had preserved through the medieval period, though historical credit typically went to ancient Romans rather than medieval Norsemen. This pattern of misattribution reflects broader European attitudes toward Viking culture. The same people who borrowed extensively from Norse innovations rarely acknowledged their intellectual debts to barbarian civilizations. Leonardo da Vinci's architectural notebooks contain heating and ventilation designs that are virtually identical to techniques Eirik's Guild had been using for centuries. Brunelleschi's revolutionary dome construction methods incorporated thermal principles for managing temperature differentials in massive stone structures. Palladio's villa designs used natural air circulation techniques that trace directly to Viking thermal engineering, adapted for Mediterranean rather than northern climates. The scientific revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries rediscovered thermal principles through experimental research that validated knowledge Norse builders had preserved for centuries through practical application. When modern physics explained why Eirik's techniques worked, the explanations confirmed engineering wisdom that medieval craftsmen had maintained without theoretical understanding. Today, Scandinavian passive house design represents the direct descendant of Eirik's innovations, using principles that have remained essentially unchanged for over 1,000 years. Modern engineers study the remaining thermal longhouses with genuine amazement, discovering that 1,000-year-old buildings still maintain comfortable temperatures through Norwegian winters using zero external energy sources. The Trondheim Museum's reconstructed Eirik design longhouse draws 50,000 visitors annually, all experiencing the same revolutionary comfort that transformed Viking civilization from mere survival to true flourishing. Visitors consistently express shock at the indoor environment: warm, dry, and perfectly breathable air, maintained entirely through architectural design rather than mechanical systems. Contemporary architects working on sustainable building design regularly consult medieval Norse construction texts, finding solutions to modern energy challenges in techniques developed by builders who never heard of fossil fuels or electrical power. The irony is profound. 21st century environmental concerns are driving renewed interest in 10th century Viking engineering. Climate change research has revealed another dimension of Eirik's legacy. As global temperatures rise and weather patterns become more unpredictable, buildings designed according to thermal principles show greater resilience to environmental stress than structures dependent on mechanical heating and cooling systems. Viking thermal construction, developed for survival in harsh climates, proves ideally suited for adaptation to climate uncertainty. The story that began with a shipwrecked merchant crawling into an Icelandic cave has become a 1,000-year legacy of architectural innovation that continues shaping how humans create shelter in challenging environments. Eirik Thornson's curiosity about why Vikings could conquer nations but couldn't conquer climate led to discoveries that helped humanity master both. In the end, the most remarkable aspect of this revolution isn't the technical sophistication of Pauto, thermal building methods. It's the way a single individual's willingness to question traditional assumptions transformed an entire civilization's relationship with its environment. Eirik Thornson proved that sometimes the most profound innovations come not from accepting what everyone knows to be true, but from asking why everyone believes it has to be that way. And somewhere in the foundations of every building that keeps people warm without burning fuel, in every structure that breathes with the seasons instead of fighting them, in every architectural solution that works with natural forces instead of against them, Eirik's legacy continues. The storm that nearly killed him became the storm that changed the world.